There will be a moment, sometimes months into watching a narcissist unravel, when you notice something that looks less like a person going through a difficult period and more like someone trapped in their own machinery, watching the exact same disaster repeat itself again and again with different people, different circumstances, but the identical underlying shape every single time. If you've ever watched a narcissist blow up one relationship, one friendship, one job, only to walk directly into the next one and recreate the exact same pattern almost immediately, you've witnessed something specific and genuinely important to understand. Today, we're naming the sign that tells you, unmistakably, that a narcissist isn't simply going through a rough patch. They're caught in a cycle of chaos entirely of their own making, one that has stopped being about circumstances and started being about something much deeper and much harder to escape. Here's what needs to be understood clearly before we go any further, because it reframes everything that follows. This cycle isn't bad luck. It isn't a series of unrelated, unfortunate events happening to someone who just keeps encountering difficult people or unfair situations. It's a self-perpetuating loop, generated entirely by the same underlying psychological structure we've discussed in other conversations, one that produces the exact same devastation over and over, regardless of who's standing nearby when it happens. And once you understand the mechanics of this loop clearly, you'll be able to recognize it instantly, whether you're watching it happen to someone you're still entangled with, or looking back at a pattern that finally makes sense now that you're far enough away to see the whole shape of it. So let's talk about the actual sign, the one unmistakable marker that tells you this is happening, because it's more specific and more consistent than most people realize. The sign is this. The narcissist experiences every single conflict, every relationship ending, every professional setback, every friendship that dissolves, as something that happened to them, entirely externally caused, entirely someone else's fault, with absolutely no discernible pattern connecting the common denominator running through every single one of these situations, which is, of course, themselves. This isn't just occasional defensiveness after one difficult situation. It's a complete totalizing inability to see their own consistent role across an entire pattern of repeated, structurally identical conflicts, spanning years, sometimes decades, involving completely different people who share nothing in common except the fact that they all eventually ended up on the receiving end of the exact same behavior. Here's what makes this sign so reliable and so revealing once you know to look for it. Healthy people, even people going through a genuinely difficult stretch involving multiple conflicts, can usually identify at least some thread of self-awareness across those situations, some willingness to ask, wait, is there something about how I'm approaching this that keeps producing similar outcomes? A narcissist caught in this specific cycle cannot access that question at all, not because they're choosing not to, but because the psychological structure that would allow that kind of pattern recognition about their own behavior simply isn't available to them. Each blow-up gets filed away as a completely isolated incident caused entirely by someone else's flaws, someone else's instability, someone else's inability to appreciate what they were offering, with zero connective tissue drawn between this most recent disaster and the nearly identical one that happened 18 months earlier with a completely different person. This produces something you can actually watch unfold in real time if you're paying attention, a narrative that keeps recycling the same core story with the names changed, the same accusations, the same sense of having been wronged, misunderstood, targeted by someone who just couldn't handle whatever the narcissist was offering. The same total absence of any acknowledgement that they've told this exact story before, with a different name in the villain role, and that the sheer frequency of this specific plot repeating itself might, at some point, warrant a different explanation than everyone around me keeps happening to be the problem. And here's where this becomes genuinely important to understand, because this isn't just a curious psychological quirk. It's the actual engine driving the entire chaos cycle forward indefinitely. Because if you cannot see your own consistent role in a repeating pattern, You have absolutely no mechanism available to interrupt that pattern. Every single relationship, every friendship, every job becomes another iteration of the identical cycle. Not because the narcissist wants chaos, but because the specific blindness required to keep recreating it never gets addressed, precisely because addressing it would require exactly the kind of sustained, unflattering self-scrutiny we've discussed as being fundamentally incompatible with how their entire psychological structure protects itself. And this is exactly where we need to go deeper, because understanding why this specific blindness exists, why it's so complete, so resistant to even the most obvious, most repeated evidence, reveals something crucial about why this cycle doesn't just continue, but often intensifies over time, becoming more destructive with each iteration rather than less. And understanding that intensification is exactly where we're headed next. That's exactly why does this blindness produce escalation instead of just repetition at a steady level? Because each unresolved iteration of the cycle doesn't just repeat, it compounds. Every relationship that ends in the identical, unexamined way leaves behind residue the narcissist can't process, because processing it would require exactly the self-scrutiny their structure can't tolerate. That residue doesn't disappear. It gets absorbed into an ever-growing narrative of grievance, a mounting collection of people who wronged me. And here's the crucial part. Each new grievance gets added to the pile without ever being weighed against the possibility that the pile itself is the evidence. So instead of the pattern producing insight over time, it produces the opposite. A hardening conviction that the world is simply full of people who cannot appreciate or understand them. A conviction that grows more entrenched with every single repetition rather than less. This is exactly why the cycle tends to accelerate rather than stabilize as time goes on. Early in a narcissist's life, or early in any given chapter of it, there's often more patience available from the people around them, more benefit of the doubt extended, more time before conflicts reach the blow-up stage, because reputations haven't yet caught up, because fewer people have compared notes, because the specific pattern hasn't yet had enough repetitions to become visible to an outside observer. But as the cycle repeats, several things happen simultaneously that make each successive iteration faster and more volatile than the last. The pool of people willing to extend first-time trust, the trust that comes from not yet knowing the pattern, shrinks, which we've discussed in the context of shrinking supply. The narcissist's own accumulated grievance narrative grows heavier and more bitter, making them enter each new relationship or situation with more defensiveness already primed, ready to detect betrayal faster because they're expecting it based on the accumulated pattern of their own unprocessed history. And the gap between the initial idealization phase and the eventual blow-up tends to compress, because with each cycle, less genuine patience remains available on their end, less capacity to sustain the performance of the honeymoon phase before the same underlying dynamics reassert themselves. This is why, if you look closely at the trajectory of most narcissists over enough time, you don't typically see a flat, consistent pattern of the same intensity repeating evenly. You see something closer to a downward spiral, where each cycle happens faster, ends more explosively, and burns through more goodwill than the one before it. The friendships end more abruptly. The professional relationships sour more quickly. The romantic relationships compress from years down to months down to, eventually, weeks, because the underlying mechanism generating the chaos never gets addressed. It simply gets fed more raw material to work with each time. More accumulated bitterness, more practiced blame, more well-worn grooves for the same story to run through faster and with less friction than it did the time before. Now, I want to address something important here, because understanding this trajectory clearly has real, practical value for anyone who's watching it unfold, whether from close proximity or from a distance after having already extracted themselves from the cycle. If you're currently in a relationship with someone caught in this pattern, understanding that the cycle accelerates rather than stabilizes over time is crucial information. because it means waiting for things to naturally calm down, waiting for the current chaos to be an aberration rather than the emerging norm, is based on a fundamentally inaccurate model of what's actually happening. The chaos isn't a phase to be waited out. It's the visible expression of a mechanism that, left unaddressed, tends to intensify rather than resolve on its own. I also want to address something for anyone who's already extracted themselves from someone caught in this cycle, because there's often a particular kind of validation available in understanding this trajectory clearly, and it's worth naming directly. If you've ever felt like things got worse the longer the relationship or dynamic continued, more volatile, more chaotic, faster to escalate than they were at the beginning, you weren't imagining that intensification, and you weren't simply becoming more sensitive to behavior that was actually staying consistent the whole time. The escalation was real because the mechanism generating it was actively compounding, feeding on every previous unresolved cycle, growing more entrenched and more urgent with each iteration. Recognizing this can be genuinely validating for anyone who's spent time wondering whether they were remembering the relationship's trajectory accurately, or whether their own perception of things getting progressively worse was somehow an exaggeration or a symptom of their own growing unhappiness rather than an accurate read of a genuinely worsening pattern. I want to leave you with something today that I think matters enormously for how you interpret this entire cycle going forward. Watching a narcissist caught in this pattern, moving from relationship to relationship, job to job, friendship to friendship, recreating the exact same conflict with remarkable, almost eerie consistency, isn't something that requires your intervention, your explanation, or your patient hope that they'll eventually see it clearly on their own. The blindness that drives this cycle is not something love, patience, or brilliant explanation from you can dissolve, because the mechanism protecting that blindness exists precisely to prevent exactly that kind of insight from ever fully landing. What you're witnessing, if you're witnessing it, is not a puzzle waiting for the right person to finally solve it. It's a structural pattern, self-perpetuating and self-reinforcing, that will keep running exactly the same way, with exactly the same intensifying trajectory, whether or not you stay close enough to keep watching it unfold. Your own peace was never meant to depend on waiting for that pattern to finally break. If this helped you understand a pattern you've watched unfold, whether in someone you're still close to or someone you've already left behind, know that you're far from the only one who's recognized this exact cycle, and there's a lot more we can work through together as we go. Make sure you're subscribed, because we go deeper into this every single week. Where we're going next.